Welcome to the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and we are honored to host the second annual Yoav Boteach Memorial Lecture. And this year, the subject is anti-Semitism. We are privileged to have a very distinguished panel that will be introduced later on. We are just celebrate Shavuot, which symbolize, in a way, the beginning of our journey as a people. But besides the Torah that going with us since then, another phenomena, the anti-Semitism, is going with the story of the Jewish people since the beginning and maybe even before the beginning. And every generation we try to find another explanation why. We come in explanation trying to cope with the situation, and most of the time we fail. And the anti-Semitism get another form. So it's a subject that can hold many seminars and lectures, but I think that today, with panels that we have, we really can get an insight which not many are privileged to have. So I'm really happy to host this event, and I would like to call Rabbi Shmuley Boteach to open the event.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending tonight. What an honor to have this event at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. I saw Menachem Begin with my own eyes in Los Angeles, California, at the Westin Hotel, I think it was called, it changed names a couple of times, in Century City, the day of a tragic event for Israel. It was at the height of the Lebanon War, Milchemet Shalom HaGalil, and that day, about 79 soldiers had died when a building in Tyre had exploded. And I could see that Menachem Begin's face was completely white and ashen-faced. He arrived in a black limousine, heavily escorted, knowing the tragedy that Israel had suffered that day and knowing that he had to speak in Los Angeles for Federation. He was going to speak Motzei Shabbat. We, at the Chabad Yeshiva of Oral Chanan Chabad in Los Angeles, we went to the hotel to greet him, and we waved Israeli flags. He was a man of small stature and huge greatness. He was pushed against the edge of the limousine. He was ashen white. And he saw us and he nodded his head. And I'll never forget that we tried to give him a little bit of comfort on that horrible, horrible day. Sadly, even greater tragedy would strike him personally when his wife would pass away, Aliza Begin, on Shabbat. And he did not give the speech that night. My father, Yoav Boteach, after whom the lecture is named today, was in the Westin Hotel waiting for him to speak with the Federation. When he left, when they came in, they announced that Menachem Begin's wife had passed away. He would be returning to Israel immediately. And my father told me that the security of the building disappeared in an instant. But Begin was a truly great man. My father is now buried maybe 30 yards from Menachem Begin on Har HaZeitim. And when my father passed away at the heart of the coronavirus on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, the second yard site was 6 days ago, I told my family, even though it was the height of the coronavirus, there was only one place we would bury my father, and that's on the holiest burial ground in all of Israel and Har HaZeitim. It was not easy, as you can imagine, given all the COVID restrictions in Israel at the time, and even bringing a coffin to Israel at the time, but Baruch Hashem, we were able to pull it off. And I'm so grateful to the two illustrious speakers who are speaking tonight for honoring my father with his very special speech. The first annual Yoav Boteach Memorial Lecture was given last year in New York City, the first public event in the Jewish community of New York, as COVID began to recede a little bit, and that was by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. We dedicated a Sefer Torah that day. It was an absolutely beautiful experience. I'm so grateful to Secretary Pompeo. And today, to do this in Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, at the Begin Center, is even more unique and more special. Our speakers today are two of the great heroes of modern Jewish history. First and foremost, Natan Sharansky needs no introduction. When he was released by the Soviet Union in a prisoner exchange with the United States of America, and we Jews should forever be grateful to the United States for negotiating that prisoner exchange, I was in yeshiva, Chabad Yeshiva, Olei Torah in Crown Heights. We weren't allowed radios. We certainly weren't allowed televisions. But I so loved the memory of Natan Sharansky. I told this story when he spoke for us at Oxford about 30 years ago in his second speech at Oxford. I took a transistor radio, illegal, in my yeshiva, and I went into the bathroom stalls every hour to hear CBS News on the hour, who were giving updates about the trip from West Germany to Yerushalayim by Natan Sharansky. I will never forget, I was lying on the floor of the bathroom trying not to get caught by my Rosh Hashiva, because I, as a Jew, was electrified that the great prisoner of Zion, Natan Sharansky, was coming to Israel. I'll never forget that day. The fact that I was able later to befriend him in some way and host him at Oxford was one of the great privileges of my career as a rabbi. And I was even there the day that Natan Sharansky received the Israel Prize at Binyonei Ha'omah about 3 years ago. So Natan, thank you so much for joining us today. Natan is a walking Kiddush Hashem. He is the great Jewish light to the nations, and we're all very grateful. Thank you. Ambassador Ron Dermer equally requires no introduction. By far the most accomplished Israeli ambassador to the United States in Israel's 74-year history. By far the ambassador who established the strongest possible connection to an American administration in Israel's history. And the ambassador who had a strong relationship with the Obama administration before the Trump administration, but who, when it was necessary, stood up for Israel's security interests, especially with the Iran nuclear agreement, which was an abomination of American values, which traversed the tread on all essential American values of not funding terrorism, of not supporting murderers, of not condoning genocide, because Iran is a genocidal power, which regularly threatens the Jewish people with a second Holocaust. I was in the room in Warsaw at the Security Conference 2018 when Vice President Mike Pence actually used the words second Holocaust to describe the intentions of the Iranian regime. No person except Prime Minister Netanyahu stood up to that aggression more than Ambassador Ron Dermer at considerable personal expense. He is a hero to the Jewish people worldwide. I had the great honor of serving as his rabbi at Oxford University. I know Ron's heart. He is my personal hero. I always look up to him. I would say that as a rabbi, in terms of what I was able to accomplish in influencing young minds that were at Oxford University, I'm certainly most proud of any modicum of influence that I had on Ambassador Dermer, and his contributions to the Jewish people are too great to ever calculate. He was instrumental in the Abraham Accords, which is such an amazing achievement. I was in Dubai. It was amazing. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, because neither of these men enjoy the kind of adulation, which I have to give them whether they like it or not, Mikza Shivcha Lefanav, it's a Talmudic obligation, so don't blame me. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Natan Sharansky and Ambassador Ron Dermer. Oh, please. Yes, forgive me. Okay.
And I think that we also need to introduce our introducer, Rabbi Shmuley Boteach. Welcome, everyone. My name is Shanna Folds, and I want to hope and wish that everybody had a beautiful Shavuot. We are going to get our panel underway, but I did want to read out some facts and introduce you to our introducer. First, I would also like to say thank you so much for coming here on behalf of Tel Aviv International Salon, which also helped put together this program tonight in this very important venue, the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, which is a world home for Jewish Zionist thought. So tonight, as you know, we are going to welcome three enormous stars in the Jewish world to the stage. And first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, being that he introduced the others first. Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, America's rabbi, whom the Washington Post and Newsweek call the most famous rabbi in America, is for many the face of Judaism in the modern world and one of the world's most respected values and spiritual voices. He's one of the leading defenders of Israel and appears as a regular guest in international media outlets. Rabbi Shmuley is also one of the world's most respected and quoted on relationships. An international best-selling author of 37 books, Rabbi Shmuley's works have been serialized in major international publications and translated into 20 languages. So let's give him a warm welcome for putting this together. Now, I know that you spoke also about Natan Sharansky and Ron Dermer, but we are going to go through this again. Natan Sharansky was born in 1948 in Donetsk, Ukraine. He was a spokesman for the human rights movement, a prisoner of conscience, and leader in the struggle for the right of Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel. Mr. Sharansky was a founding member of the Helsinki Group, which monitored violations of international agreements of different religious and national groups in the Soviet Union. He worked closely with Andrei Sakharov, the renowned Soviet human rights activist, and kept close contact with foreign media beyond the Iron Curtain. In 2009, Sharansky was appointed chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel. The mission of the Jewish Agency is to guarantee the future of the Jewish people by strengthening the connection of every Jew to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people. Very important. In 2018, he received the highest Israeli award, the Israel Prize, for promoting Aliyah and the ingathering of exiles. Mr. Sharansky is the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He's the only living non-American citizen who is the recipient of these two highest American awards. Mr. Sharansky famously developed a vital definition for the new anti-Semitism, the third test, to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. The second, of double standards. The third, of delegitimization. The third principle was widely accepted by different organizations that fight anti-Semitism and was included in the international definition of anti-Semitism, which is also extremely important. He is the author of 3 books, Fear No Evil, The Case for Democracy, and Defending Identity. He remains a champion of the right of all people to live in freedom and believes that the advancement of human rights is critical to peace and security around the world. Absolutely unbelievable. We're going to move to our other panelists. Ron Dermer, former columnist for the Jerusalem Post, and in 2004, co-authored with Natan Sharansky the best-selling book, The Case for Democracy, The Power of Freedom to Overcome Tyranny and Terror. From Dermer, as Dermer served as Israel's Minister of Economic Affairs in the United States from 2009 to 2013. Between 2005 and 2008, he served as senior advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Between 2013 and 2021, he served as Israel's ambassador to the United States and was widely seen as one of the most consequential ambassadors ever in that role, as well as one of the most creative and influential ambassadors from any country during his tenure in Washington. One of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's closest advisors, he was a driving force behind many of the era's most important diplomatic developments, working in close partnership with the U.S. counterparts on securing long-term military assistance and missile defense funding for Israel, something that we have used time and again, even within the last 14 months. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv was a part of his work, attaining U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, implementing the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, which we're fighting every day, and achieving the historic breakthrough that led us to the Abraham Accords, something that I'm reporting on every day of the week. And the normalization of Israel's relations with several Arab nations, It is absolutely unbelievable. I want to thank you all. I'm going to be hosting your question and answer. Again, my name is Shanna Folds, and if you do have questions, please save them for the end. I'll be back to grab them from you and pass them to our panel. Thank you so much.
Sharon. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
You know, Shmuley, after listening to those introductions, I'm actually excited to listen to this panel.
I want to say Shehiyah.
And if it was only your mother saying the introductions, Ron, it might be even a little bit longer. Okay, let's get straight down to this important panel on anti-Semitism. Natan, I was in Dubai, hosted by the Jewish community. I feel I was safer walking with a kippah and tzitzit in the streets of Dubai and Abu Dhabi than I am walking some of the streets of Yerushalayim. I was warned by people, don't come to Yom Yerushalayim, it's too dangerous. I was told by other Israelis, Yerushalayim is too dangerous. I went today to Hebron, I just came back, which is why I'm a little bit sweaty, forgive me everybody, too dangerous. How much anti-Semitism is there within Israel itself that threatens the citizens of the country? And what can be done about it?
Well, I don't think you are afraid to, if you're afraid to walk in kippah in Jerusalem because of anti-Semitism. I don't think, it's, of course we have a huge problem with the terror, and I think we Israelis learned how to live or to cope with this fear, but the terror doesn't differentiate. If you think that by taking off kippah you can be saved from terror attack, that's absolute illusion. Even if you are Arab living in Jerusalem, you have the same chances to be the victim of those who really want to destroy Israel and to make Israel non-existent. Of course, they are anti-Semites, and the biggest effort in my life, in the last 20-something years, with this, with the help of Ron and some others, was to prove that the fight against Arab terrorism is also part of the fight against anti-Semitism, as well as the fight against anti-Zionist professors in American universities. It's also a fight against anti-Semitism. And it's true that in Paris, and today in some places in America, people prefer to take off kippah, being afraid of anti-Semitism. By the way, it's something which people are not afraid today to do in Ukraine or in Russia, with all the differences. So that's something.
They keep their kippot on, you're saying, in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, well, no, whether they keep on or, first of all, they keep on. And both in Russia and in Ukraine, with all their different awful differences. But second, there is no fear that because they will be recognized as Jews, that will be the reason for being attacked. There are many other reasons for being attacked, but not because they will be recognized as Jews. And there's something really unbelievable change in the world which first happened in Paris, like 20 years ago, when for the first time the rabbi started saying to children in the schools not to skip kippah. And today I hear more and more from different friends in America. So it's happening in America.
Can I just challenge you on that for a moment, Natan? A Catholic friend of ours came on this trip with us this time, and she wanted to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I wrote the book Kosher Jesus, and I enjoy seeing the Christian holy places in the Old City. So we started walking her to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Via Dolorosa and the 14 stops of the crucifixion. And she was clear that because she did not look Jewish, she felt safe. We were wearing kippot, we did not feel safe. So to say that the terrorism is directed at everybody in Yerushalayim, I'm not sure that's the case. I think that people who look Jewish might be targeted more. Is that not the case?
First of all, people who look Semitic can be attacked more, and many Arabs also look like Jews. And second, again, in Israel we are attacked by our enemies, and it doesn't matter whether they be wear kippah or don't wear kippah. In America, different.
Yeah, I'll say about the march, what was interesting to me is the broad spectrum within Israel who supported it. I was pleasantly surprised by that, because it wasn't a normal right-left split in Israel. You saw people really on both sides who says it's important to go and march and to express our pride on Jerusalem Day, and I think that was a good sign. I agree with what Natan's saying. I don't think that all of these have to do with anti-Semitism, but I think you're right in the sense that you've seen a lot of attacks, particularly against ultra-Orthodox Jews who are going, which is going to be obviously the ones that are clearly Jewish, and they're preyed on sometimes when they walk to the Kotel in the Old City, these attacks. So it is a problem, and it is true that you have a mixture of nationalistic reasons why these attacks are happening, but you have the importing of what was once European anti-Semitism into the Middle East in general and into the Palestinian world in particular, the demonization of the Jews and these wild ideas against Jews that did not exist before the birth of Israel, really. But since the birth of Israel, I think Bernard Lewis, the Middle Eastern historian, spoke about how that penetrated the Arab world. And you see that in how Jews are demonized today in Palestinian society. It's changed in the broader Arab world, like you said, in Dubai and in the Gulf, elsewhere, but it's still an acute problem within Palestinian society.
Natan, well, so what you're saying, Ron, is that beyond the political question of who controls this land, and you might find some reason that the Palestinians hate Jews that is not traditionally anti-Semitic but is more territorial, you're saying that there are more traditional demonized caricatures of Jews that come from Europe that have been embraced by our enemies here, that has more of a longevity to it and is not strictly territorial.
Yeah, I think that's true. You'd have to ask yourself, how would the actions be if this were not a Jewish state but a Christian state? For a certain radical Islamist ideology, do they treat Christians different than they would treat Jews if the Christians were my majority in this country and they were fighting them? And I think there is a difference because it's based on thousands of years of anti-Semitism that has certainly penetrated the Arab and Muslim world.
Well, like about 20 years ago, they started films in Egypt and then in Hezbollah TV station in Syria. And they were showing Jews who are taking the blood of babies for making matzah. And that purely Christian anti-Semitism, which, well, of course there was a Muslim anti-Semitism, but it was never about blood used for matzah. So, it's so yes, there is a lot of hatred, which now is using all the old stereotypes of anti-Semitism, of pagan anti-Semitism, of Christian anti-Semitism, of National Socialist anti-Semitism, and all that.
So you agree with Ron that a lot of it is not just about an argument about land, but a lot of it has been imported with traditional caricatures, demonic caricatures of the Jewish people.
Well, anti-Semitism is used or is mobilized for different political purposes. When you need to encourage to revive the hatred towards Jews because of some or another reason, you can always use this very rich heritage of anti-Semitism which exists. So no doubt that when Palestinian leaders decided in the beginning of the 20th century, with the beginning of Zionism, they started the struggle for the land, and then struggled to how to mobilize, to incite this hatred towards Jews, which probably existed but in much weaker forms before. And we can see how even in the last 50 years, 40 years, in the last 20 years, how more and more modern weapon of anti-Semitism is brought to Palestine to encourage this hate.
Look, Bernard Lewis, I mentioned before, he writes about this. How did you have European-style anti-Semitism penetrate into the Arab world? Because historically it wasn't there. Jews had a dhimmi status there, there was discrimination, there were attacks against Jews, so we don't have to romanticize what happened to Jews in the history of the Middle East and in the Muslim Arab world. But he, if I remember correctly, the factors that he said changed it. One was the Mufti, who was a huge anti-Semite. And
he was a Nazi, essentially.
The Nazi, more than a sympathizer, but an uber collaborator with the Nazis. And Nazism came into the Middle East, and when it came into the Middle East, wherever the Germans were, and the Mufti would do it in broadcasting on radio to the Arab world, he would actually foment this Nazi propaganda against the Jews. So that was one thing that helped it penetrate. And then there was the issue of Israel's victory in its war of independence. And if I recall correctly, the way Bernard Lewis explains it, is that it was such a humiliation for the Arab world because in their folklore, the Jews were cowards. I mean, Christians are a serious civilization. So when Christians defeated Muslims, yes, it was a blow, but it was something that was understandable. Whereas to be defeated by the Jews is the bully of the class or the one who sees himself as this warlike figure, to be defeated by the weakest person in the room. And so they had to make sense of this defeat. It couldn't be that the Jews actually fought them fairly and won. It had to be that they were manipulating the world powers. And so the protocols of the elders of Zion and these motifs that had nothing to do historically with Muslims or Arabs, that's how that entered the Arab world. And since then, you've had a series of one thing after the other that built on it to create this old-style European, largely Christian incitement against Jews that had penetrated the Arab world. By the way, the Christians got it from the ancient Greeks, but that's another story. I mean, this thing is a powder keg that goes back some 2,500 years.
Well, that's the theory of Ben Zion Netanyahu, right? That anti-Semitism predates Christianity. I want to get back to that in a moment, but just before I want to move on, just before we do, the reason I'm asking this, Natan and Ron, is that my grandfather is from Lomża in Poland, and I have a good relationship, thank God, with the Polish government. I go there a lot. A lot of Jews are very hostile to Poland. Now, thank God, we see a reestablishment of relations because of the Ukraine war. But the main thing my grandfather used to tell my mother is that they were afraid in Poland. And my grandmother is from Lithuania, from Vilna, and they were afraid to be Jewish. It doesn't make sense to me that we should be afraid to be Jewish in Israel, and it bothers me when people are constantly telling me, oh, you can't go to Hebron, you should be afraid. You can't walk through the Arab Shuk, you have to be afraid. And I, as a Jew, if there were an area in Israel where Arabs had to be afraid of walking, I would protest it. I would say that's incompatible with Jewish values. So it's the fear issue that I thought that we built our own country not to be afraid. So Natan, when you say that it's not only, sometimes it's not anti-Semitism, maybe it's just, they feel they don't want Israeli dominion, this is more about land. The Christian groups walk through the Via Dolorosa with no fear. They have absolutely no fear. They barely have security. But we have to have massive security. So it bothered me a little bit because I feel that I deserve to not be afraid. Otherwise, where have we come? My grandfather was afraid in Warsaw 800 years ago. And now we're surrounded by Israeli soldiers. I just fear the one thing is we shouldn't be afraid in the same way our Arab brothers and sisters are not afraid to walk the Mimela Mall.
But I think, anti-Semitism is there, but that's less about anti-Semitism than a collapse of deterrence. Meaning, the problem is law and order. When somebody gets arrested, it's sort of you need a reverse, or what's going on right now is a reverse broken windows theory. Like, you don't deal with small problems, there's no law and order, and if there's no law and order, then you start having these problems that fester and get worse and worse and worse. So there is an answer to it. You're not going to all of a sudden wave a magic wand and make the Palestinians stop hating Jews. That's been going on for a century and will probably continue. But you can enforce law and order. You can make people afraid to break the law, but for that you have to have a very, very tough system, both with the police and with the Supreme Court, and how you treat criminals. You don't have that. And I think you do see, and this is it's not just a criticism of the government, of the specific government we have today. This is a problem that goes back several years. You see that when you travel in the Negev and there's no law and order there, or in other places of the country. And we have to reestablish that law and order as quickly as possible. And then I think Jews are going to be a lot less afraid to walk the streets.
I really believe that while we have many reasons to be concerned about different things which are happening in Israeli politics and Israeli social life, your concern about fear of Israelis to go to Judea, Samaria is a wrong concern. Because, first of all, in Israel there are, 500,000 people are living behind the Green Line. Everybody serves in the army. The most important thing, Israelis, and that is the question of how we are defending ourselves, how we are running our country. It is in our hands. I am much more concerned with the fact that Jews have fear to go with kippah in the free world, and I'm much more concerned with the fact that young Jews are afraid to be associated, identified with Jewish people and with Israel in Harvard, in Yale, and that's something which is the danger which grows every day, and that's really you should be concerned.
Okay. I'm equally concerned with that, and so let's talk about that. As we look at the non-Jewish hatred of the Jewish people and its longevity and its surprising reawakening, surprising because we all were hoping that it would be more dormant. Before I speak specifics about the campuses and BDS or the attacks that we've seen in places like Poway or Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh by neo-Nazis, the extreme right. Who knows what all these definitions even mean, extreme right, extreme left. I think a lot of them are arbitrary, but let me first put this question.
First of all, that's a fabulous ringtone, whoever it is. So if somebody could come up to me afterwards and tell me what it is, because it definitely gets your attention.
Okay. Natan, about in 2015, so 7 years ago, it was a year before Elie Wiesel passed away. And I want to go from the general to the specific, so I'm not going to ignore what you just said, but it was one of the last public appearances that Elie Wiesel made. He would pass away on July 2nd, 2016. I loved him very much. When I was at Oxford, the two people I really wanted to bring to Oxford was Elie Wiesel, who I brought several times, and Natan Sharansky, who I also brought several times. Elie Wiesel said to me on a panel, which all of you can watch on YouTube, he said to me, I said, Rabbi Eliezer, is anti-Semitism endemic to the non-Jewish heart? Is there some sort of DNA strand? So he said to me, and I was hoping he would say no, because I don't believe there is. But he said, Shmuley, halacha shesona esav liYaakov. It is an axiom of faith that the non-Jews hate us. So I then debated him and I said, Rabbi Eliezer, you're the Jewish light to the nations. You're the great witness to genocide. Non-Jews read your books in all of our high schools, American high schools, in France, and they gave you the Legion of Honor. You can't believe that non-Jews really hate us. And then you know what his response was? Halacha biyadua, he quoted from the Talmud. It's an undeniable axiom of faith. Is that true, Natan, that we can't escape anti-Semitism because it's endemic to the non-Jewish heart?
Maybe you have to wait to the last year of your life to say it, I don't know. But I think that the world needs this hatred. This hatred exists, I think, as it was said correctly, before Jews appeared. Before Jews appeared, always there was the evil beginning in this world and good beginning. And as Jean-Paul Sartre later said in 1945, that for anti-Semite, the closest thing for Satan is Jew. So the world needs Satan. And it was so easy just for the Jews who are bringing these rules or not atheism and the other things which are restricting or changing the life of the world, and they are they are different. So to see them, this Satan, and then no doubt that anti-Semitism, this hatred to the other, was helping to the dictators or to the leaders in pagan world and in early Christian world and in the 18th and 19th century and in our days. So yes, I think as a phenomena of hatred, yes, it exists independently from Jews. Does it mean that if you are not Jewish, inevitably you will have this disease? Of course not. I don't think so.
So you think it exists as something permanent, as an essential part of creation.
I can say a funny thing, like 18 years ago or something, I am the minister who is dealing, among other things, with the problem of the anti-Semitism, and I am giving a report, a yearly report in the government. And about the anti-Semitism, I just came from the campuses, what's happening in America, and then it was a big thing, what's happening in France, with this new anti-Semitism, and explaining, and then one minister, who until these days is a very important Israeli politician, he told me, Natan, how many years we can hear your reports about anti-Semitism? You're a chess player. You are believed to be a very good chess player. You cannot invent something that we will finish with this. Who needs it, this anti-Semitism? So, well, 20 years later, he said to me that he realized it's possible. So, if we think that our aim is to finish once forever with anti-Semitism, it will exist. Our aim is to make sure that this hatred is not damaging us, or making minimal damage to Jewish people and to the state of Israel.
So you're saying it is permanent. It's not in the heart of all non-Jews. It will forever be in the heart of many non-Jews because
and many Jews, by the way. Many Jews. I'm not racist. I believe that anti-Semite can be Jew and non-Jew. Yeah. Okay.
That's a great quote. Sad and tragic, but a great quote. Ambassador Dermer, do you think that anti-Semitism is endemic in the non-Jewish heart?
No. I haven't really thought about this issue, but I agree somewhat with what Natan is saying. It gets to the why is there anti-Semitism, where it comes from, which we can have 3 or 4 panels on. We don't have enough time today. But Natan and I tried to understand that, and we wrote a piece for commentary called On Hating the Jews about 20 years ago, and trying to find the golden thread of the anti-Semitism throughout history. And the golden thread is that the Jews were standing against the current. And when the Jews stand against the prevailing current, largely because of their faith, but not only, like in Nazism, it's not about a faith, but they're standing against this racial current, then you see this sort of backlash. So I do think that anti-Semitism is endemic in the Western tradition. It is part of Western civilization. A lot of great things in Western civilizations, and anti-Semitism was also part of it. But I certainly don't think any individual, his heart has to be poisoned by anti-Semitism. And I would say also, Yaakov and Esav, not every non-Jew is Esav either. So is it Esav, who's I think a grandfather, great-grandfather of Amalek? So it's an interesting conversation to have. But I actually think that the basis for anti-Semitism is sort of hostility towards the mission of the Jews in the world. There are some people think it's irrational. I don't believe that. I think the Jews stand for something in the world, and I think our enemies stand against that. That's what it's about. What I would say is that no one should be surprised with the return of anti-Semitism. I think it surprises me that people are surprised, and I think it speaks to historical ignorance. Because we can look back at it now in 2022, and we can say that for 50 years, after the Holocaust, it was politically incorrect in Western society to go after Jews. You could do it in the Soviet Union, in the Arab and Muslim world, but in polite Western society, you couldn't go after Jews because of the Holocaust. And a lot of people thought that was the new normal. But that was the aberration. And what we're now seeing is a return to the historical norm. And to a certain extent, the Holocaust has, I think, distorted not only the non-Jewish view of Jewish history, but the Jews' view of our own history, because it is such a blinding event. It is like a sun that blocks out all the stars in the sky. I mean, they're there, you just can't see them when the sun's out. So after Hitler, nobody can see all the anti-Semitism before it. Now, 4 months ago, if I would have asked this audience, who knows who Bogdan Khmelnytsky is? Begin Center's a smart audience, so you probably get 5 hands. Maybe now you'll get 15, because we've moved from Khmelnytsky to Zelensky. But nobody, when I would, Lehavdil, that's right. I said the 2 national heroes, it's amazing, of Ukraine. You go from Khmelnytsky to Zelensky. But when I would ask people when I was ambassador, does anyone know who Khmelnytsky is, a crowd of 100 or 150 people, you'd be lucky to get 2 hands. Now, this is a person in the 17th century who killed somewhere between 150,000 to 300,000 Jews in the Pale of Settlement, and he's kind of lost from Jewish history because of the Holocaust. And if you take the Holocaust out of the equation, what you see is 25 centuries of nonstop attacks on Jews. So people tonight, I don't want to give a homework assignment, but go home and pick a century of the last 25 centuries, any century, and just look in that century, anti-Semitic attacks against Jews. And it'll make your head spin. And people forget when Herzl envisioned the whole idea of creating a Jewish state, it was largely as a response to what he thought was endemic anti-Semitism. And he said, well, if we have a state of our own, that's how we'll deal with anti-Semitism, because his understanding and some other early Zionists was that the reason why there's anti-Semitism is the Jews don't have a state, because we're a majority nowhere, a minority everywhere. So if we have a state of our own, we'll be treated like other peoples around the world. Now, this is 50 years before the Holocaust. So they understood that this was a constant problem. We've forgotten that history. So you're back at the Dreyfus trial. Take the Holocaust out of it, and we've forgotten it. And the irony right now of what's happened with anti-Semitism, in Herzl's time, they thought the reason why there's anti-Semitism is the Jews don't have a state. Now they say the reason why there's anti-Semitism is the Jews do have a state. Then they said Jews go to Palestine. Now they say Jews get out of Palestine. But the truth is, Israel is not the cause or the cure for anti-Semitism. All it gave the Jews was the power to fight back. And I disagree, one final point. I don't believe we're going to end anti-Semitism. And we can have a discussion about this, because I think the big mistake is people think if you educate people, you'll end anti-Semitism. Or if you know history, Voltaire, father of enlightenment, huge anti-Semite. In the last century, you had T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, all sorts of thinkers. And today, the real bastions of anti-Semitism are coming from the intellectual classes. So I don't think you're going to end anti-Semitism, but we have to fight it. And now we have a sovereign state to fight, and hopefully the Jews in the United States and other diaspora communities will stand tall, stand proud, and fight back, because we have the power now to fight it. We should use it.
I just want to thank the Begin Center for actually delivering cappuccinos in the middle of a speech. That's next level. I don't want to have a speech anywhere else. I'm only coming back here. But you see, as we would say in the Talmud...
I didn't get a cappuccino, by the way. I'm just putting it out there.
Well, you had to ask. Those who don't ask don't get.
As we would say in the Talmud, lamai nafka mina. This ideological question as to the source and the origin of anti-Semitism has a practical outcome, and that's kind of where I'm headed. I haven't forgotten about BDS on campus, something that I fought against on campus and continue to, but first we have to establish the cause, because I think it's actually going to determine how we fight it. Okay. So both of you said, Natan and Ron, that there does seem to be something intrinsic about anti-Semitism. Not in every non-Jewish heart. We see that evangelicals are our best friends today. A lot of people question their motives, but we see they're our best friends today. And then you have people who, we all have friends who are non-Jews that we would never accuse of being anti-Semitic, but you're saying it's still a darkness that the world can never purge itself of fully. So lamai nafka mina, how will that determine how we fight it? Well, if anti-Semitism is a mystical force that can never be fully eradicated, then we can't explain ourselves to the world or explain Israel to the world, because we're knocking our head against a brick wall. It's always going to be there. So instead of trying to influence it and change it, we have to combat it and fight it. But if it's something based on a belief that the Jews killed Jesus, we can respond, we didn't kill Jesus, it was Pontius Pilate that killed Jesus. If it's that the Jews are the conscience of the world, and they hate us because we're the conscience of the world, as the Talmud says, related to Shavuot, Mount Har Sinai, the mountain of hatred.
And Hitler said that.
And he said the same thing, right? The mountain of hatred, they hate us because we taught the world goodness, and they hate us because we represent goodness. Then we can make them better, then they'll hate us less because they sign on to ethical monotheism. But if it's something mystical, then all we could do is fight it. And on campus, Matan, what is our purpose on campus? If they hate us no matter what, then our purpose has to be to give Jewish students pride and fight BDS, because you're never going to change BDS. But if those students can be persuaded otherwise, because it's not intrinsic, then we can give them facts, we can give them history, we can bring them on Christian birthrights, we can teach them about the land. So you see what I mean?
say that when I was the head of Jewish agency, and even before I invented this program of shlichim on campuses, I always was telling to shlichim, your aim is not to convince our enemies that we are not as bad. Ignore them. Your aim is to convince, to show to Jews, to convince them, to mobilize them, to feel they have nothing to be ashamed of their connection with Israel and with Jewish people, and they have a lot of reasons to be proud of. Because, after all, that is our aim. Our aim that anti-Semites will not succeed to undermine, to weaken our people. And if the connection between our people and Israel will be weaker, Jewish people, those who are not in Israel, are in danger. Israel, of course, has to fight stronger than enemies, but Jewish people are in danger. So our enemies understand it very well, sometimes much better than Jews understand. And they're trying all the time to weaken this connection. They understood they cannot destroy Israel. They try to weaken connection between Israel and Jewish people. They try to make Jews be ashamed of this connection. And at the same time, they are afraid, at least after the Second World War, they're afraid to be accused of anti-Semitism. That's why our aim, together with Ron and years after this, was to show that that is anti-Semitism. What you're doing, BDS and all this stuff, that is anti-Semitism. But that's why this 3D principle was proposed, because that's how is this almost illogical phenomena you can analyze logically and you can see it. That's why it's very important to give people tools to identify it, but then also to show that it has nothing to do to real Israel and to real Jewish life.
See, was that for me or Natan? Thank you, both of you. Thank you very much. But Natan, I'm still a little bit confused, respectfully. If the purpose, I want to get to, in a moment to whether BDS is anti-Semitism. Some people would just say they like Jews and they don't like Israel. Okay, but if BDS is anti-Semitism, you're saying that you taught your shlichim at the Jewish agency that your purpose is to show that that identifying with Israel is not...
To work with Jews, not with anti-Semites. Yeah.
Oh, so you believe that they could not really be changed, most of them. I'm not talking about SJP, Students of Justice in Palestine, who are real haters. The majority of students who come to these...
Of course they can, but for this you need to involve them in logical discussion. The problem is, we went 20 years ago after the Dermer, so suddenly we accused, we are the racism and the genocide of the world. And then we invented the tools how to involve them in not only Jews, but confused students and liberals in this discussion. We invented demonization, double standard, and so on. And then the second stage, I would say, they refuse to discuss. BDS understood very quickly that the moment they start seriously discussing the issues, they will lose. So, as by the way, the fourth book which I wrote together with the Geopolitical was not mentioned here, Never Alone. They were speaking about some things of the last years. I remember in Brown University, I'm coming together with Mike Douglas speaking about Jewish identity, and there is a demonstration, BDS demonstration. And I go to the demonstrators and I see everybody with the slogan, Israel is a genocide, boycott Israel. And I choose one girl who definitely looks for me, nice Jewish girl, small of my tall, so it's easy to see eyes to eyes. And I say to her, you know, you are too young to remember what is genocide in South Africa. As a friend of Nelson Mandela, as an international observer of the elections, the man who spent a lot of time in Soweto, let me tell you a little bit about South African apartheid, also not genocide, apartheid. And then you and your friends will decide. She looked, she got the sign from her ringleader, and then they start shouting, we didn't come here to talk to you. We came here to demand boycott Israel. So that really became typical, I would call it second stage. We are not discussing with those who are for Israel. We cannot give the power to these oppressors and so on, of speaking. We simply demand boycott. And then the third stage is when, and that's real demonization, when international bodies like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, are publishing the documents calling Israel apartheid state. But they frankly say, it's not what was in South Africa, but what is in Israel, we call it apartheid. So it's exactly like Sartre said that for anti-Semite it is Satan. They call Jews Satan, and in Russia really, I know peasants who thought that at night Jews have the horns and the tail and so on. So here, the international...
You don't have them? You don't have them?
Well, sometimes I try. So here the most respectable liberal international human rights bodies say it is not exactly apartheid, but we call it apartheid. And that is something that we call Israel Satan. That's what they say. And that's why I'm saying you don't have to, I ask for it.
Seek and thou shalt find.
So that's why I'm saying, look, we have now to say, no, we are not Satan. We have to explain to Jews or confused young liberals again and again how dangerous, how fight is from the beyond of their values. That's what we should.
So, but the story that you just told seems to demonstrate that we have to confront and oppose rather than explain, that the explanations are falling on deaf ears right now, that they've just decided to demonize Israel. Your 3 Ds again are demonization.
Right. Yeah, demonization.
The difference. Well, let me just confirm the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism.
Right.
Of
So
Israel.
first of all, I'll tell you the background of the story because
Okay.
it's a humorous one. So I worked with Natan on developing some of these ideas, and when he was charged with the Israeli government of being the minister responsible for the global struggle against anti-Semitism, and this is during the so-called Second Intifada, when there's attacks against Jews all over the world. One of the problems is there's no standard. So it's like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. This is not anti-Semitism, it's legitimate criticism of Israel. And one thing Natan taught me was in the Helsinki group, which he established in the wake of the Helsinki Accords between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was a human rights basket. It was security, economic, and human rights. And the human rights basket, the Soviets had no intention of keeping to their commitments, but this Helsinki group basically said, here's a standard, and we're going to hold them accountable. So one of the problems you have is a constant argument about the definitions of anti-Semitism. So we tried to put an end to it by saying, here's a way where you can spot anti-Semitism. And we discussed this. And I thought about it for a while, and I came to Natan. I said, listen, we got the 3 Ds. We've got demonization, double standard, and delegitimization. And we changed the last D. It's a little bit like the Three Stooges, where you had Shemp and Curly at the end. It's actually denial of Israel's right to exist. So demonization, double standard.
Just go through them again. What are the
demonization? I'll give you an example. Double standard and denial of Israel's right to exist. Okay? And I came into Natan's office and I was excited because we had been talking about this for a while. And I said, Natan, it's like a 3D movie. Because you see on the screen in a 3D movie without the glasses, everything is blurred. So they're trying to blur the lines between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. If you put on the 3D glasses, it pops out at you. And Natan says to me, what's a 3D movie? And I realized he had never seen a 3D movie. But those are the 3 Ds. And it was enormously successful I think Joschka Fischer was the first one, the German foreign minister, to adopt it. And now all of a sudden, you have a standard that you can hold people accountable. The first step is create a standard, yes, no. Demonization, double standard, denial of Israel's right to exist. Now, you mentioned the issue about BDS. The first thing with BDS is to understand that BDS is an anti-Semitic movement. But you got to explain why to people, why it's anti-Semitic. And the way I would when I was ambassador, when people would come to me and they'd say, this or that organization, a church group or an academic group is going to boycott, divest from Israel. The first question I ask is, what number are we on their list? Is Israel the 5th country, the 10th country, the 20th country, the 40th country on their list? Because if there's a list, then they've got a standard, they've applied that, they've cast the net wide across the world. And Israel is one of those countries. Now, I think my job as Israel's ambassador then is education. I got to go, I got to engage with them, and I have to explain to them the facts and the context and the history and everything else that people in this room probably know. But if we're the only ones on the list, if the only country that they're singling out for boycott, divestment, and sanction is Israel, and I'm not talking about, there is an exception here, Jews and Palestinians. Because Jews and Palestinians don't have to accept a universal principle before they actually focus on this conflict. But if there's an academic group or a church group or a union group or something, and they have decided that Israel is the only country in the world that they're going to apply BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction, then they're anti-Semites. They may not know that they're anti-Semites. You can be, as Larry Summers, the former president of Harvard, said, you can be an anti-Semite in effect without intent. But it's anti-Semitism. And those people, I'm not interested in engaging. Those people are trying to delegitimize us. We just have to delegitimize the delegitimizers. And you have to call them out on that, and you have to accuse them of anti-Semitism and be very, very clear about it. And I think whether it's applying the 3Ds or BDS, that tool to me is relevant first and foremost for Jews. It embarrasses a little bit the non-Jews, but I agree with Natan 100%. The goal here is to convince our own people of the justice of our cause and to actually spot anti-Semitism. The issue for the non-Jews is something else. It's what we talked about at the beginning. Are people afraid to go after Jews? And the problem we have today is they're not afraid to go after Jews. And we have to reinstill the fear in them to go after Jews. And that begins with the Jews themselves taking the stand against them. It's not like hiding behind other groups and telling them, no, you take the lead. And I'll give you a specific example. When I saw this point that really deeply concerned me, and it was after Ilhan Omar in Congress said something that was patently anti-Semitic. And the Congress of the United States was going to condemn her. And then what ended up happening is that condemnation was watered down. And was watered down to the point where Ilhan Omar voted for her own quote-unquote condemnation, which means it was not a condemnation at all. They added Islamophobia to anti-Semitism. They created this kind of grab bag. Now, why did that happen? I'll tell you the backstory. That happened because the Congressional Black Caucus went to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and they said, we are standing with Ilhan Omar. We do not want to see this pass. And she saw pressure that was coming from the CBC, but she didn't see any countervailing pressure from the Jews. That was the moment where the Jewish leadership of the United States had to take a stand publicly and say, this is Yarek Val Yavur. For us, this is not an issue of race. This is a member of Congress saying something that is clearly anti-Semitic, and we expect that the leaders of the United States will speak out against that, full stop. And instead, they went to the sidelines. And so the first step towards changing it is for the Jews, whether in Congress or on a campus or anywhere else around the world, to take the stand. That's how you'll have other people coming to you. Natan knows this better than probably anybody alive. The Jewish organizations don't rush to take this stand. They're not Nachshon ben Aminadav. When he was trying to make a rally in Washington to confront Gorbachev, they were the last ones on board, not the first one on the board. He had to first take a stand, rally his people, the students and housewives, as he called them, to come to Washington. And then afterwards, then all the Jewish organizations tell you, I organized the march to Washington. No, it begins with individual Jews standing up. If that happens, it will make a difference.
But I want to give examples of something of the last year, your achievements with Abraham Accords. Here we have established relations with Bahrain. And the person who was responsible for dealing with anti-Semitism in Trump administration, Mr. Starr, yeah?
Carr.
Yeah. So, in conversation with me, he speaks with excitement that just now they signed with Bahrain agreement about fighting anti-Semitism based on the international definition. I said, and also fighting, meaning the demonization and hatred of Israel. He said, yes. Then coming delegation from Bahrain, and I also, the head of ISGAB, Institute for Fighting Anti-Semitism, meeting with them, and I was asking them, do you realize that what you just signed, it means also that you are again going to fight against demonization, legislation, double standard of Israel? So of course we are going now to build these new relations. Why should we be interested? At that very day, I get email that San Francisco Federation made a decision that they cannot support international definition of anti-Semitism because for some Jews it means that it will restrict our opportunities to criticize Israel. So that very day when Bahrain decides to accept international definition of anti-Semitism, some Jewish federations have big problem with it. That's our problem.
Okay, right, and none of this is kind of believable, or maybe it is, unfortunately.
I would just say a little rejoinder to that. So I don't know if Elon told you, Elon Carr, who did a terrific job as Trump's envoy in fighting anti-Semitism, Bahrain at first was not going to sign it. This was before. And he was on the way to a ceremony to sign something. And they said, we're going to take that out. And the Trump administration said, we're not coming.
Wow.
And then they changed afterwards, and they did it. So it takes leadership to actually be willing to take a stand to have this.
But I suspect that if Trump said, I will not come to San Francisco if they will not accept this definition, it will not help.
Then you'll get every institution in San Francisco to follow the Jewish Federation. That's how the Jewish Federation in San Francisco can unite the city.
Natan and Ron, what you're saying is, to me, sadly accurate, but also very kind of sad, because Ron, you remember when you were our student president at Oxford that we influenced thousands of non-Jewish students, and we had no doubt that we could influence thousands of non-Jewish students. And Natan, when you came to speak for me, you primarily had an audience of non-Jewish students. You spoke at the Oxford Union, and 2 years before you spoke for me, you spoke for the Oxford Union itself with thousands of students hanging from the rafters. And we kind of all know that that's no longer possible. If we had brought you to speak at Oxford as Israeli ambassador, there would have been such massive demonstrations, even though you're an alumni, just because of the position that you occupied. When Danny Ayalon, we all know Danny, when he spoke at Oxford, he almost got attacked. And then his security whisked him out. And I heard the same thing happen recently to Tzipi Hatovelli at the Cambridge Union. So it's kind of sad to me, because Natan, you're saying now, see, the Abraham Accords was an interesting thing. It was the outside-in approach. If you can influence the Gulf states, then maybe the Palestinians will understand they're losing mainstream Arab support because they're tired of this conflict, and maybe the Palestinians will understand they need to make peace. That's what we did at Oxford. If you influence the non-Jewish students, and you just said the Jews often follow, if you make them proud of Israel, or hearing Natan Sharansky, hearing Elie Wiesel, the great lights of the Jewish people, then the Jewish students will also be influenced. Now you're saying, we can't even do that anymore. We have to influence the Jewish students, have a strong identity, stand with Israel, don't be ashamed to be part of Israel. I had a head of Hillel who said to me, we're not standing up for Israel on campus, not because we don't love Israel, but because they won't come to us for Shabbat dinner anymore. If we take a strong stand on Israel, the students are going to boycott us. I had a leader, I'm Chabad, a leader of Chabad tell me that. We want to put tefillin on students. We want them to light Shabbat candles. We celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, they're not going to come. So we have to separate between Yiddishkeit, Judaism, and the Jewish state. And Natan, so are you saying that we've lost the ability to directly influence non-Jewish students on American campuses?
Oh, well, I think that non-Jewish students are influenced by this fear of Jews to demonstrate their solidarity with Israel. So the best thing to influence on non-Jewish students is to bring back to Jewish students this pride, this feeling of meaning of their Jewish life when they're connected to Israel. I'm fully for working with non-Jews. Most of my life I'm working with non-Jews on these topics. But I'm sure that if we lose our battle with Jews, we will never win it with non-Jews.
Yeah, also you can't... Also, you
That was for me
can't-
too. I got
You
it.
can't take, look, you're living at a time also where minorities of people can have a huge impact on the debate. Because of social media, minorities, you can have 2, 3, 5, 10%. The masses, the problem you have with masses of Jews, certainly in the United States, and by the way, the United States is a very important, the American Jewish community is very important in terms of diaspora Jews, because they account for about 2/3 of the diaspora Jews. But we can also look at other Jewish communities around the world outside the United States and how they deal with this issue and how they preserve that sense of Jewish pride. It's different. It's a different story for different reasons. So, but I think the wide swath of the American Jewish public is basically more apathetic. And what you have a lot of, unless they see an acute security danger for Israel, and then they come out of woodworks. I saw that in 2014 when the criticism of Israel, which is always there, and it's very noisy, that sort of went by the wayside, and the large mass of American Jews rallied in support of Israel. The difference in 2021, last year when we had the violence in Gaza, is that the critics weren't silent during the war. That was new. In 2014, they just stopped talking, and then once the guns stopped firing, they went back to just criticizing Israel all the time. But I think the larger problem you have is you have a passionate anti-Israel group on campus, and then you have the Jews of silence. And you don't have a strong enough group. And when people are watching this happening on campus, the non-Jews, they're going to follow the passion. You know, sincerity is what people follow now. They're very sincere in their belief. Less about the facts, less about the details. Oh, these people are genuinely believe in it. You have all these things now in the United States, you know, safe spaces, and everybody's triggered, and nobody wants to be politically incorrect. Well, when they see this anti-Israel group very vocal and very fierce, and the Jews are quiet, which do they follow? They think these guys must be right because they're very passionate. And that's why I said you have to restore the sense that it cannot be open season on Jews anymore. You have to fight back. And listen, the arguments that they have, I just tell you very quickly because we're in a session. You know, this thing is so ridiculous and absurd. Apartheid. You know, go to a hospital, go to a university, go to the Knesset, go to the court, go anywhere in Israel, and you see it has nothing to do with apartheid. And in fact, I remember, first time I went into the Oval Office was with Natan. When George W. Bush, unbeknownst to us, got a copy of the book and invited Natan and I got to tag along to this meeting in the Oval Office. And it was a big deal. You go into the Oval Office for the first time. I didn't know at that time that I had many opportunities to go in the Oval Office. I thought that may be the only time in my life that I'll be in an Oval Office. I was born and raised in America. It was a big deal. And I said, what am I going to say to President Bush? What am I going to leave him with if I could leave him with one thing? And what I said to him in that meeting is, and they were accusing Israel of apartheid then, because the turning point when it became politically correct to go after Jews was Durban. Durban to me is the turning point from one age, which is the post-Holocaust era, to a new era where it's this open season on Jews. And there were all these charges of apartheid then. And I said to President Bush in that meeting, I said, Mr. President, you know, they say Israel's an apartheid state. We're the only country in the history of the world who took blacks out of Africa to freedom. Okay? And tried to leave an impression with him. You have charges of genocide against Israel. Then we must be the dumbest genocidal force in history because the Palestinians are 5, 6, 7 times the population that they were in 1948. You have a Nobel Prize winner for literature who 20 years ago compared Gaza, the situation in Gaza, to Auschwitz. Now, Auschwitz. With Auschwitz. Okay, now, in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it goes back a century. 20,000 people have died on both sides, about 22,000. If you take the entire Israeli-Arab conflict, you get to 125,000. But in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's 20,000 on both sides. In May 1944 in Auschwitz, 10,000 Jews were being murdered every day. And here's a Nobel Prize winner for literature comparing Gaza and refugee camps to Auschwitz.
Was that the name?
I think it was Saramago. He was Portuguese. So this attack on the Jews for all of these wild things, they can be easily dismissed, but we should not we shouldn't lose sight of something we spoke about before. Why is this happening? There's a book that was written I think it was published in 1943. It was actually written right before news of the Holocaust and the scale of the Holocaust was well known. It was written by an American academic named Joshua Trachtenberg. It's called The Devil and the Jews. I highly recommend it. And this scholar is trying to understand why people believe the most wild things about the Jews. Blood libels, poisoning wells, spreaders of plague, and why not only the ignorant masses believe it, but the intellectuals believe it, and why this is impervious to any fact. And he comes up to with the conclusion, they believe it because they want to believe it. That's what this is about. The anti-Semites, stop trying to understand how we're going to make them not hate us. Make them fear us, because that we control. And you can make this go into abeyance. Right now, in the United States, to say things that are racist or to say things that are homophobic, you're immediately shut out of society. The cancel culture gets you right away. Now, I'm not for cancel culture at all. But if they're canceling everybody for everything, I don't want the Jews to be the one group where it's okay to go after Jews. We have to instill in the leaders, both in Israel and abroad, first and foremost the Jewish leaders, the sense that there will be consequences for anti-Semitism. If there's no consequences, it will grow. If there are consequences, it will recede.
You know, I wish we had a month to discuss this.
I have to say that Ron is speaking very powerfully, but I'm afraid you're speaking about the fight which we had to have and we continue to have, but day before. Today, we are not only there is silent majority of Western Jews, we have small but very vocal intellectual leaders among Jews who, in principle, deny the right of Israel to exist. That's what we call the Jews with Giltroy. In this 21 war, for the first time, we had open letters of the leaders of Israeli study centers, of some reconstructionist Jewish activists, people who are responsible for Jewish life in their communities, who wrote letters that Israel is racist colonial invention, and we don't want to have anything with this. And then later, when I spoke to some of them, they explained to me, Jews were building their identity for 1,000 years without Israel, and we have now to reinvent or rebuild our identity without Israel. They are small, but they are very noisy.
Very vocal.
But they are very noisy, and we have to mobilize silent majority of Jews against them, because that is the real danger. Not danger for Israel. Israel has nothing to do danger for the disappearance of American Jewry.
So I would get asked a lot of times, am I concerned about the rise of anti-Zionism among Jews in America? I said, compared to what? Compared to 100 years ago when most of American Jewry was anti-Zionist? I mean, you're right what you said about the intellectual class, but at the end of the day, I don't think they matter, and they will be lost from the train of Jewish history. The ones who matter are the masses. It's to reach out to the Jews over the heads, and the ability we have right now in technology is to deal directly with them. They can talk among themselves. The intellectuals can do that, but I don't think they have an audience. I think the mass of Jews in the United States and around the world wants a connection to Israel. And yes, there were all the naysayers. They were there before. When Herzl had the idea of a Jewish state, it was rejected particularly from the intellectual classes. The one that supported Zionism were the masses of Eastern Europe. They were the ones who held the line that we'll come here and not go to Uganda. So I'm with those Jews. The intellectual Jews, I don't have a lot of time or a lot of patience for them. And I think we spend too much time dealing with all those arguments and too little time actually dealing with the masses. Chabad is the most effective Jewish outreach because it doesn't engage in all these intellectual debates. It goes to the Jews. Go to the Jewish masses themselves. They want this connection to Israel. The problem that we have is you have a generation that doesn't remember a world without Israel, that doesn't remember a vulnerable Israel, and it requires a renewed effort to reach them with all the tools of technology that we have today, and doing shlichim and other programs you can have. But really, last thing, you know, we Jews have a unique capacity of seeing the glass as 1/16 empty, okay? We are a uniquely privileged generation. As much as we think the problem of anti-Semitism exists today and it's come back, our grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents going back 100 years would have given anything to trade their problems with ours. And we are a uniquely blessed generation that have a privilege, now a fourth generation, to live at a time when there's a sovereign Jewish state. And with that privilege comes a responsibility to secure it for the future, which requires not just prime ministers and prisoners of Zion or even ambassadors. It requires each and every one of us to take that fight and to make people pay a consequence for going after Jews.
Okay, very true. We're better off than any generation. But so many people here, Ron, are Americans. And the one thing we almost never saw was overt anti-Semitism in the United States. If you say to me that Europe is lost, I bet, who here believes that Europe is lost to the Jewish people? Clap if you believe that. Okay. That's what I almost always hear, even though the Rebbe sent me as an emissary to Western Europe. And it's pretty bad in Europe. Who believes that the United States is lost to the Jewish people? Wow. Okay? So prior to Tree of Life, where you went with President Trump to comfort the community, I never would have heard that. We never believed that the United States was lost to the Jewish people. Natan, you spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu, I'll never forget it, after the attack, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and the attack on the Jewish market in France, and you said, there's only one place safe for the Jews, and that's Israel. Now, American Jews never believed that. If we came to Israel from the United States, it was from ideological reasons, not from anti-Semitic reasons. We never thought that we were at risk in Pittsburgh and in California and being beaten up in Times Square. I watched the harassment in Times Square during the last year's war in May. Now, you can't say that anti-Semitism in the United States is because of the culture of Christianity, because Christianity never bred that kind of anti-Semitism in the U.S. It's not like Catholicism in Europe, which is kind of dead in Europe anyway. You also can't say that it's cultural. It was cultural in keeping Jewish quotas in the Ivy League universities. It was cultural in the what's it called country clubs. But to speak openly with such hatred of the Jewish people like Ilhan Omar, the halls of Congress, unheard of. To call Jews loving Benjamins, obsessed with greed and money, unheard of. This is new. So on that score, you can't say that we're better off before, because American Jews are in shock. We are in shock at what's happened. That Jews are being gunned down, that a rabbi had to throw a chair in Texas to stop another nutcase from murdering Jews. I'm not even talking about the schools and the shootings. Natan, you never saw this kind of anti-Semitism in the United States. America brokered your release, right? What's happening in America?
Well, here you're moving now a little bit in the other topic. I'm really very concerned about the role of America in the free world. Not only about Jews, but the free world. We needed America in Soviet Union because that was the only hope for to defend liberal democratic world. Today in America, we have people on the left, progressives, who are against liberal state. We have people on the right who are against liberal state. And whether they are against liberal state because it is all the oppressors against oppressed, that's bourgeois invention, or they're against liberal state because it's all the plot of elites and all these elections are not real democracy, it doesn't matter. In the end, if America will not be true to this idea of liberal state and fight for or protect, defend the liberties all over the world can be lost. And the fact that now we have already 3 presidents for whom it was not top priority. Today, because of Ukraine, somehow American administration again is directed to this situation. We'll see how far. But in fact, since President Bush, America is not concerned about the situation of human rights in the world. that's broader problem where anti-Semitism is a part of it. Now, as you said, yeah, I agree that never before we saw, and now we're speaking about anti-Semitism on the left and the right. I don't know, but this guy in Buffalo is killing 10, or 20, well, how many, non-Jews. But he wrote on the internet before that it is Jews who are bringing here in this foreign workers and take jobs from us. So they say he's a right-wing anti-Semite. Then there's other guys, Black Lives Matter, in fact, say that Jews are those who were bringing slaves from Africa to America, and that's how slavery is, how this problem started. And that is on the left. And in fact, there is absolutely no difference. If you think those who are saying Jews will not replace us, and those who are saying that Jews are those white supremacists who created race problem, they are the same. It doesn't matter. And from this point, fighting against all these prejudices, it's fighting for liberal America, for which human rights and human dignity is at the top of the agenda. Are we losing this America? That is my big concern. I'm asking many Americans in the profession, others, believing that we are losing it. I do hope that we Jews will be those who will prevent it. But for this,
You see the two as connected, the rise of anti-Semitism and the decline of America standing up for freedom? You see them connected?
I think naturally that the less American society, both on the left and the right, is concerned about the real human rights problem. Now Black Lives Matter are very concerned about racial problem. For Black Lives Matter, Martin Luther King is their enemy because he was like the voice of this liberal society which imposed on us all our yes. The moment the voice in the Black America is not the voice of Martin Luther King, but Black Lives Matter, yes, of course, it means that liberal society becomes weaker and Jews have a problem. And the same with the right.
So you're saying that the decline of America as the great protector of freedom, that means that they're standing up for Jews is also declining.
There is danger that there is kind of very dangerous process of America, all its parts, losing this unique feeling that we are those who defend and protect this idea of liberal
democracy
democracy in the world. And at the moment it is weaker, yes, the rise of it.
I see the problem somewhat differently in the United States. I think it's all been subsumed by politics. And I think politics has hobbled the struggle against anti-Semitism. And I saw that very powerfully in Pittsburgh, where the second it happened, there was just a rush to put everything on Trump. And it fit a narrative that said Trump is responsible for all this white supremacy, Trump is responsible for the attacks against Jews. You remember when he first...
No Jewish leader would travel with him.
I'll get to that in a second, yes. No Jewish leader came, which I think was absolutely shameful. Because when President Trump, he said the wrong thing after Charlottesville. Forget about going and reverse engineering the tape. That was a hanging curveball that should have been hit out of the park, and it wasn't. He missed an opportunity as president to speak forcefully after Charlottesville. But in Pittsburgh, he said the right thing and he did the right thing. And in fact, that evening, when you're talking about Americans, what the American public, I was watching, it was a Saturday where it happened, and my guard came in. I was at lunch with my family on Shabbat, and he told me about this terrible attack in Pittsburgh. And that night, I watched the rally that Trump gave in Illinois that night. And Trump said, those who seek their destruction, he's speaking about Jews, we will seek their destruction. Basically, those who go after the Jews, we will go after them. And it's fine, okay, Trump said it, he says a lot of things. 30,000 people applauded. 30,000 people. I told Trump in Pittsburgh that to the best of my knowledge, no non-Jewish leader has ever said in Jewish history what you said. The closest, I told him about Purim. In that 30 seconds that I had to walk with him to the synagogue, I said, the closest we come is in Achashverosh, who says to Mordechai, those who seek your destruction, you can seek their destruction. He doesn't say we, the Persian army, are going to fight for the Jews. But large sections of the organized Jewish community turned on Trump. It's all about Trump. It was unprecedented attacks against Jews. You remember right after the November 2016 elections, you also had a number of Jewish federations that there were all sorts of bomb threats. It turns out it's some guy sitting on a couch here in Israel who's the one who did it, but let's leave that aside. The narrative was all about Trump, and the FBI statistics showed that it was higher than it had been for several years. What they didn't tell you, what none of the leaders who were so hostile to Trump would say, is that between 2000 and 2010, according to those same FBI statistics, the number of attacks against Jews were all higher than they were then. Jews account for 2% of religious groups in the United States and about 2/3 of the attacks.
Of hate attacks.
Of hate attacks against religious groups or against Jews. This is an old problem, but it doesn't fit a narrative nobody pays attention. Trump, it fit into a narrative, and then it got into right and left. Within minutes of the attack, I did an interview right afterwards, and all they wanted to know was they wanted the ambassador from the state of Israel to blame Trump for the attacks against Jews. And I said it's been going around for about 2,500 years. And there was an attack in Wichita when Obama was president. There was an attack in the Holocaust Museum when Obama was president. But nobody remembers all of these things, in Seattle as well, in the Jewish Federation, because they didn't fit a narrative. What has to happen in the United States is the Jews have to put politics aside and start focusing together in the fight against anti-Semitism. That's what has to happen to turn the tide. And more than anything else, that will change it. And up until this point, they've been unwilling to do it. So when they see what's happening in Charlottesville, the white supremacists with the tiki torches, one side gets all fired up about it. When the other side has anti-Semitism like Ilhan Omar, the other side goes at it. And they're refusing, and there are notable exceptions, but largely refusing to go after the problem on their side of the political aisle. But there is one difference. With everything that I said, there is one difference between a person like David Duke and a person like Farrakhan. Both of them are anti-Semites. But no one will take a picture with David Duke. And they will take a picture with Farrakhan. When people are when people are embarrassed to take a picture with that venomous Jew hater, when people are embarrassed to do that in the United States, then you'll know we're winning the struggle against anti-Semitism.
We call Jews termites. Okay, I have one final question. We're going to go to your questions. Ron, when I was on my way here, you and I were talking about what constitutes legitimate criticism of Israel. So, Natan, I very much respect that you were critical of, and I'm sure not everybody wants to hear this, but of Israel's, well, we don't know Israel's exact position on Ukraine. It's kind of been different between Lapid and between Bennett. But I agree with you that the United States has to stand up for democracy. Your book with Ron, The Case for Democracy, I think is one of the truly important books that have been written over the past few decades. I'm not surprised that President Bush became the biggest promoter of the book. Not bad for a book tour when the president is telling everybody to buy your book. He did the same thing.
He didn't do that for kosher sex, yeah. Why don't you write, you can write kosher anti-Semitism.
Yeah, he did it for kosher lust, but not for kosher sex. Anyway, but Natan, you have been critical of Israel not being forceful enough in their condemnation of Putin's aggression. I agree with you. I wrote that several times. My friends came to me and said, Shmuley, with all the critics of Israel, do we really need you to join? And I said, don't be ridiculous. Our whole argument with the Palestinian society is that they're not in any way introspective. Israel is the light to the nations. It is the great, and I understand Putin, Iran, and they're on our border in the north with Syria, and Putin's good to Chabad. I said, just wait till one Chabad rabbi criticizes him, we'll see how good he is to Chabad. And he gives he gives the Iranians their anti-missile, and I'm not even going to make the case about Ukraine, but I agree with you. A man bombs children, murders children. If we Jews don't speak out first, then what are we? But is that legitimate criticism of Israel? How do we, not that God forbid I would ever insinuate it, but how do we separate that with the people who are the unfair critics of Israel and who may not get the whole security situation? Like if Ron Dermer is sitting there hearing me say this, he might be saying to himself, oh my God, there's so much classified information that Shmuley doesn't know because he couldn't possibly know, but I can't reveal it. I don't know if that's going through your mind. I get that. But I'm a rabbi. I need to speak out how I have to speak out. You're a world-renowned humanitarian. How do we distinguish between criticizing Israel legitimately and illegitimately?
For this, there are 3 Ds. What I was telling to everybody, especially now when they say in some federation that 3D is restricting our right to criticize Israel. That why do we need to demonize Israel? Why do we need to use double standard of Israel? If you really cannot criticize Israel without demonizing it, then probably you are anti-Semite. So that's also true about Ukraine. Every Israeli citizen should feel himself or herself absolutely free to disagree with the government. And that's one of the questions of disagreement. I didn't say that Israel is as bad as Putin. And I didn't say that Israel is supporting dictatorships. I also said that in this battle, which is not about piece of land where I was born, it's battle about what kind of the free world will have. Will there be this principle that if your neighbor is stronger than you, he cannot take your land? Or if you are giving up on this principle, that whether Ukraine is only the first victim of Putin or Putin will be stopped. So it's from the first hour of the war, I was telling that is the war of all of us. We Israel have invested interest. And by the way, also it's not only that it's moral position. I think it's also pragmatical. In the next 10 years, I think Putin will be the closest to devil, to Satan, for the world. And Ukraine became, because of Putin, because of Zelensky, because of many other things, became the symbol of the struggle for freedom. And one of the leaders of Ukraine, when I sent him an email of encouragement, the first bomb started falling on Kyiv. And he is one of the most important of their leaders. I sent him simply some notes of encouragement. And he answers me, Natan, after many good thoughts, he says, Natan, but who could think that we will live to the day that the bombs will be falling on our cities, and Israel will refuse to give us the most simple things of defense which it has.
You mean Iron Dome?
No, well, it's about the most simple things. You have to understand that until this day, at that moment we refused to give field hospital because it was too close to the war. And we refused to give caskets. Today we are giving caskets, but on the condition that it will not go to the soldiers, but only to the medical workers. You have to understand that, yes, there are reasons to be afraid, but Israel knew how to cope with the fear from Russia. And then when Israeli minister says to me, in fears, he can't believe, you believe that Israeli weapon should kill one Russian soldier? I said, no, I don't want to kill any soldier. I want that Israeli weapon will be used to protect somebody. But when you see this fear of upsetting Putin at the moment when he's launching one of the most barbaric attacks on free world, and by the way, later I saw this fear in Washington when I came to speak to Washington. So step by step, the free world is getting out of this fear. And I do hope that Israel will also get out of this fear. It has anything with the demonization of our country? Of course not. I hope with some political changes, Israel can take some different position. But in general, I do believe we as our government or as our decision makers, we are doing both moral but also practical big mistake that until this day we are not ready, even indirectly, to third countries, to give any defensive, the most primitive defensive weapon to Ukraine in this war.
Wow. Well,
gentlemen, we have to wrap up. We need to wrap. We have a lot of hands in the crowd that want to grab questions, and we're getting down.
But we've got something that hasn't happened in about 25 years. I disagree with Natan on something. I disagree with him.
And we finally made news.
Yeah, and I respect Natan's position. There's nobody, no public figure in Israel or the world who I respect more than Natan. Putting me in the same sense of him, other than him being my mentor, I wouldn't be in the same category. But I have a disagreement with Natan on this. Natan to me here is the prophet and not the king. And the prophet has to say this is the right path to take, this is the morally pure path to take. but the king has to make very difficult decisions. And to me, the first responsibility of the king is to protect the lives of his own citizens. And I think the criticism of Israel and its position in Ukraine is certainly not anti-Semitic. It's just wrong. It can be a legitimate criticism of Israel. I just don't think in this it's legitimate, particularly coming from the United States or Great Britain or France or Germany. And the reason why I understand is we have many interests. We obviously have to get our citizens out. We have to open the doors to Jews coming. I personally, right, I get it. And I'm in favor of opening our doors wider to let non-Jews come, even in higher numbers because of the unique history that we have as a people. But when it comes to the decision of getting involved in this, understand we border Russia in Syria. And right now, Russia has acquiesced to Israel's conduct of military operations in Syria. Now, why does it do that? Well, one reason is we're serving their interests because we're attacking Iranian positions, which in Syria is a competitor for them. And another reason may be that as much as he is demonized, and you may be right, for the next 10 years he may be the greatest demon in the world, he is not an anti-Semite. And in fact, an argument can be made that he's a philo-Semite, and certainly the least, the most philo-Semitic czar, which is a low bar, in 1,000 years. And that combination of him serving his interests and also not having hostility towards Jews has really kept Israel safe. It's kept your children or your grandchildren or your nephews or your brothers safe because we don't have Israelis getting knocked out of the sky, and we don't have Iran, which they're trying to do, create another Hezbollah beachhead against Israel from Syria. And so the first job of the government is to make sure that Israel maintains its freedom of operation. Now people say, well, if it's a Russian interest to do it, even if Israel criticizes Russia, it'll still be a Russian interest. Not certain, because Russia has other interests. And if we poke Putin in the eye, then he could very well change his policy. He may do that anyway, and we might be there in the same place. But here's why I think that the criticism of Israel, other than Natan, but the criticism of Israel is not moral. And I'll tell you why. Because it's coming from people who are making a deal with a country that is openly calling and actively working to destroy us. And they're making the deal with the Russians. So here you have President Biden and his administration, you got Boris Johnson, you got the German government and the French government, and they are going to criticize Israel in moral terms for not arming the Ukrainians. I don't see America going to Ukraine and risking their sons and daughters to fight the Russians there, but they want to risk Israelis in fighting Russia on our borders. Now, what would change my position? I think they have no moral standing. To say, confront Russia, but appease Iran, that doesn't translate well into Hebrew or in Arabic. What would change my position is if Natan Sharansky was in the White House, or someone like Natan Sharansky. Why? Or even Reagan. Because if there was a leader in the White House who was separating the world into the good guys and the bad guys, if he was confronting Iran and confronting Russia and confronting all of these bad actors, and then he would come to Israel, his ally, and say, we want you to stand with us. And yes, we know that Russia may change its policy over the skies in Syria. We're going to have your back when they do that. Now, if an American president said that, and he showed through his actions that he was prepared to do that, I, as Israel's ambassador, or as an advisor to the prime minister, would tell him, stand, that may be Putin, stand with the United States. Stand with the free world. Israel cannot be expected to lead the free world if the free world is not leading the free world. That's my point.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, gentlemen. We got to wrap this up.
You twisted my position.
Gentlemen, we need to wrap this up. You guys have been on a last question for 30 minutes. We got to wrap this up.
I have the last word, okay. And the last word is
It's 9 years in prison. Give him a few minutes to respond.
Putin loves Jews. A lot of dissidents hated me for saying it all the time, and I say it today. It so happened for the first time in 1,000 years in Russia that there is a leader who loves Jews. But Jews don't love, will hate the world which he tries to build. And Israel has to make very clear our position that we are against that world which he tries to build. As to position whether America or Britain or France have a moral position to criticize us, of course not. As you know, I wrote about it, and they have absolutely no right to criticize Israel. But we can be very critical about our position, especially in view of historical position, that Putin now tries to rebuild the world in the way which neither Jews nor Israel wants.
Sharansky 2024, that's what I say.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Natan in the White House, okay.
All right, thank you so much. And yes, I know, Mr. Sharansky, you were in jail for 9 years, but I am a woman with few patience from South Queens, and we got to move this on. I would like to ask whoever has a question, please come down here to make things easy for me on the right side. I want to remind everyone that your question absolutely must have a question mark at the end, and it cannot go on for too long. I'm going to cut you off. And gentlemen on the panel over here, we're going to have a lot of questions, so we're going to do a rapid fire, meaning that you can't take too long on your answers, okay? Can we raise the level of the mic on the Wi-Fi mic? Speak up, tell me your question.
You just say it loud and then...
I'll continue. I'll continue with the thought of Ambassador Dermer, and my question would be, and I'll explain it. Shouldn't we educate the world more about the Holocaust? Now, when Bibi was in Berlin, unfortunately, he was criticized for, so to say, using the Holocaust for his speeches. I made 30 films about Shoah Letkuma, and I lecture all over the place, Europe, mainly Germany and America, and I see the effect that people learn about what was the Shoah to teach them how, to stay away from anti-Semitism.
So the question is, should Israel be teaching the world more about the Holocaust?
Of course we should, as much as the world wants to hear, and even if the world doesn't want to hear, we have to teach. But whether it by itself, it's very easy for our opponents simply to say, okay, Holocaust is something which belongs to the past. So we have to show again and again why it doesn't belong to the past. And you cannot do it without taking what's happening today and showing why it is connected to this.
Okay.
So for me, quickly, I'll just say the most important thing is to teach our own people, primarily the lessons of the Holocaust. And it's not just about man's intolerance to man. You can learn that. You don't have to have 6 million Jews die to learn that lesson. The lesson from the Holocaust is the Jews have to have the power to defend themselves. That's the lesson that we have to learn and teach Jews.
Natan, you're very right. We have to focus on the young Jewish generation. But the problem is we are losing them big. You mentioned students discussing Palestine. They are not the problem. I know them very well. They were funded in Berkeley. Nobody pays attention to them. The problem is in campuses, organizations, Jewish organizations, like J Street, Youth and Fun, Troar, Ben the Ark. They are focusing on the young generation, and very effectively, they are turning them against Israel. And people don't know about it. I mean, you mentioned Brown University on Independence Day. Brown University on Independence Day had program on the Nakba. Your Shaliach was involved. And the same thing happening at Columbia, and Princeton, and Harvard. J Street is winning. So the question is, and there's you talk about modern anti-Semitism, there's the modern anti-Semitism. And they are not only...
So Natan, you're saying that Jews are involved in promoting this on campus?
Not only on campus, it's
Okay.
all over. You had Natalie Portman, selected for Genesis Prize.
Question.
She rejected the agenda, or she wouldn't accept it.
No, but what you don't know, she's a leader at J Street.
Natalie Portman is problematic, and it was surprising to me that, yes, okay.
The question is, why are not we focusing on the real problem, on the Jewish anti-Semitism?
On the Jewish anti-Semites.
Which they are winning right now, by the way.
Jewish anti-Semites are winning. What do we do about it? Ron?
I think that we can confront them, but the bigger thing is to take the masses, as I said before, of Jews. You know, you have a battle in Jewish history. It's not something new. The problem with most Jews is our sense of history, let alone the rest of the world, usually goes back to breakfast, okay? This has been going on for a long time. We've had a battle between the Hellenists and the Maccabees in one form or another that goes back 2,000 to 3,000 years. And you have people that want to go with the universal currents and are those people who want to embrace the particular. What I think will change the calculus, unfortunately, is the emergence of anti-Semitism. And I think it's going to create two different consequences among Jews. One, people will, from that hatred, will want to embrace their Jewish identity, and for others, they'll want to run further away. The ones who run further away will be lost from the train of Jewish history. We should focus on embracing those who want to be on that train.
So Natan, do you believe that Jewish anti-Semitism is an even bigger problem than non-Jewish anti-Semitism?
No, Jews are a big problem. As we said, and Jewish anti-Semitism, after all, it's, and I agree here with Ron, it's minority of minority of minority, but it symbolizes some serious problem which we have.
Okay. We're going to go to,
No,
we're going to the next
please.
question.
Next question.
We're going to finish by 9 o'clock. I promise. Natan, we got 5 minutes.
Okay, my name is Chesdi Ramon. Ron, I'm sorry, it's a big honor to meet all three of you, but Ron, is the current administration anti-Semitic?
No.
U.S.?
U.S.
Okay.
No. They're not anti-Semitic. And certainly Biden is not. And Biden is somebody who you could call a Zionist even. And the reason why you can call him a Zionist is he understands, and I've had many discussions with him about this, he understands the right of the Jews to have a state and the importance of it. It's something he actually learned from his father in the wake of the Holocaust about 10 years after. So he gets that. The problem that I have with the administration, just as I had with the Obama administration, is that the policies that they're trying to advocate in the Middle East are extremely dangerous for Israel. But we don't have to say because their policies are dangerous to Israel that makes them an anti-Semite. I thought that disengagement from Gaza was very dangerous for the country, but Sharon did more to defend this country than almost everybody in the history of the state. So I wouldn't call him an anti-Semite.
But he did pay with his reputation, Ron, did he not?
Yeah, he did. That's a different story. I think when we use the label anti-Semite, we have to be very careful of only using it for clear-cut cases. Jeremy Corbyn was an anti-Semite. And I should say, in mentioning him, that shows you the power of the Jews to change the tide. Because British Jewry, that was very, they don't have the reputation of standing tall and standing proud. And they don't have a reputation for unity. But when they were facing a real anti-Semite, they actually united, they took a stand, and by taking that stand, I think they rallied many non-Jews to reject Corbyn. Be careful about putting that scarlet letter A on the breast of anybody, and I don't think you can say that about the Biden administration.
Is the squad anti-Semitic?
Definitely. I think Omar has clearly said many anti-Semitic things. Tlaib has said many anti-Semitic things, and I think the more problematic of them is AOC. Because she represents, I think, a greater movement. Omar could be an Islamist, and we understand where she's coming from. Tlaib is a Palestinian nationalist. We understand where she's coming in from. But AOC and what she has said, particularly in holding Israel to a double standard and also demonization, I don't know if she's gone full out and denying Israel's right to exist. By the way, there's one exception that you don't, if you deny Israel's right to exist, it doesn't make you an anti-Semite. If you believe no nations have a right to exist, then you're not an anti-Semite. But I haven't encountered many of them. But 2 of the 3 Ds, she has clearly failed. And is a huge problem because she's got that Twitter feed, she's got a lot of people following her, and that's the type of thing that we have to confront. But it has to start with the Jews, not the other members, to take that stand.
Thank you. Next question.
Got 2 minutes.
Eli Ben Moshe from San Diego. I actually very close to Poway, where everything happened. I knew everybody there. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here and talking about the fighting Jew, especially at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center.
Thank you.
I'll tell you why. The Menachem Begin Center, for a generation like mine, he's the fighting Jew that we actually saw, that we didn't just read about in history. We actually saw him in action. It's amazing. The question. Ron, you tell us about the masses and how we can go above the intellectuals to the masses. There's definitely a break for the first time in the United States in politics between a party who votes consistently for Israel and a party that does not. Why are the masses, the Jewish masses, not switching parties? Or are they, am I mistaken, are they, but just slowly?
We're not going to be able to answer this question in about a half a minute because it's a broader issue in American politics. I'll make this observation because it's an interesting question. It has to do with the history of American Jews, of the Democrats being a party of immigrants, the democratic language also appearing to the messianic ears of the Jews, of reforming the world. But I tell you something to understand about American politics that's critical, and it's a change that has happened over the last 30 years. It has nothing to do with Jews, and it has nothing to do with Israel, but it affects Jews and it affects Israel. And that is, there are fewer and fewer competitive elections in the United States. There are more and more landslide elections. When you are a competitive election, you have to get the middle voter. And the middle voter in America is pro-Israel and doesn't hate Jews. When you have landslide elections, which well over half the Congress right now is in landslide elections, what you do is you race to the primary. And you have to get to the hardcore base of both parties. So when you see numbers that say 75% of Americans are supportive of Israel, 70%, that's true. America is overwhelmingly pro-Israel. But what matters in American politics today are 15% on the left and 15% on the right. That 15% on the right is overwhelmingly dominated by evangelical Christians that have a very clear view about Israel. Some people argue what their view of Jews are, leave that aside, but they have a very clear support of Israel. On the other side, that's when you have an AOC or you have a Bernie Sanders that is much more powerful than otherwise they'd be, because today 5, 10, 15% can determine elections in a way that was not true 30, certainly not 50 or 70 years ago. That's a problem that people have to see, and they have to fight back against it.
Okay, we're going to have to make this the last question. I'm so sorry, but thank you. My credibility with the speakers is on the line.
All right. I surveyed
You never had credibility with us.
I'm sorry?
We're going to enter one more question.
No, I took a survey of all the questions, and I chose the one that I think is the most important question to end with. What can the individual do to fight anti-Semitism?
Natan. What can an individual do to fight anti-Semitism? What can the person do?
Look around. Find Jews who are not sure that is the real something threatening to Jews, and try to start with Jews. Try to convince them that's very important for their own survival. Then is an easy part how to move to non-Jews. The moment you have Jews on your side, it's easy.
So you certainly believe if we instill a proud Jewish identity in people and they love Israel, they will influence their non-Jewish environment.
And they understand why it is dangerous, what BDS and others are doing, why it is dangerous for their own survival. Because even this is important for survival of Israel, okay, we'll write a bigger check for Israel. But it's not a threat for Israel, it's a threat for Jewish people.
So the first thing I would say is that everybody should buy Natan's book, the first one, which is actually the good book called Fear No Evil, because then you know how one individual can stand up to anti-Semitism and change the world. So required reading, send it as gifts to everybody. Fear No Evil is the best book that Natan wrote. The second thing...
This last one.
What? The last one, they're all available on Amazon as well, and they make wonderful centerpieces when you stack them 10 high. What I would tell you is that each person has to fight in their little neck of the woods, and you never know what kind of impact it has, either on Jews or on non-Jews. Tell you a quick story. I was in Congress with a member of Congress when I was arguing against a nuclear deal with Iran. He was from New Jersey. And I was doing the best I could to mobilize support against the deal to get Congress to reject this thing because of what a disaster it was. And I sit down to one congressman And I'm 2 minutes into my pitch, why this deal is so bad, and he tells me, forget about it, I'm standing with Israel. Don't waste your time. Go spend time with other people, I'm gonna vote with you. So I have 28 minutes of my 30 minutes left, and I wanna know why. You know what he tells me? He tells me that when he was 15 years old, he was an immigrant to the United States. And no one would let him and his friends play basketball. He was thrown out of every place. The one group that did was a JCC. And he never forgot that act of kindness. And he said, I will always stand with Israel. I will always stand with the Jewish state. So these small things, like that woman who may have lived upstairs from Mr. Putin and fed him,
Let me wrap this up.
these small things can make a big difference. The last point, I said
It was a Democrat?
what?
Was it
Yes, Democrat. I said before that I believe anti-Semitism is embedded in the foundations of Western civilization. But guess what? So is Judaism. And I think the problem we have with many young Jews is that the pull of the universal is very strong. And it's very hard for them to appreciate the particular. What we need to do is get them to understand that those values that they most admire about Western civilization actually come from the Jews. Social justice, which everyone talks about now, there's no more important statement of social justice than the statement that everyone is created in the image of God. The idea of the rule of law, when the prophet Natan rebukes King David. The idea of embracing widows, the stranger, or caring for the widows and orphans. It all comes from the Jews, and most young Jews don't know this. I had a quote book 25 years ago, and I'm leafing through it, and I see one quote of great leaders, and it says, who is the rich man, the one who is happy with his portion? Benjamin Franklin. Okay? That's the problem. Tell them it's not Benjamin Franklin. Tell them it's the Bible. We have, with the technology, we have the ability to engage young people with all the tremendous ideas of Judaism and to make them understand that the bedrock of the values that they cherish the most actually comes with the Jews. Then they'll have pride in their Jewish heritage and tradition, and then that will make them, I think, more able to fight against the anti-Semites who seek to harm.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it remains for me just to thank everyone, and then I'll turn it over, first of all, to Tel Aviv International Salon. God bless you guys. We've done a number of events together, and we're going to be bringing Brett Stevens to Israel in a few months. We'll do another event, God willing. I just want to thank Natan and Ron, who've been friends for many decades, because they honored my father tonight, and my father taught me to be a fighter for the Jewish people. Ron used to speak to my father on the phone all the time. He loved you. I think I also got Natan on the phone with my father once, because I always my father wanted to speak to Israel's great leaders. My father just instilled within me a ferocious Jewish pride, and it's no coincidence, it's providence that my father is buried right by his hero Menachem Begin on the Har HaZeitim. My father taught me, as Ron just said, never allow the Jews to be in the defendant's chair, always go on the attack, and make sure that anti-Semites pay a price for their anti-Semitism. Thank you all for coming tonight.
All right, everyone, thank you very much.
What are the glicks, my mechutanim, to Avi and Tzipi?
Everyone, thank you. My name is Shanna Folds. I've been your host for the evening. Jewish unity, we should all feel it. We should all practice it. Thank you. This has been an event with Tel Aviv International Salon. Have a great evening.
Did you come over?
60 שנה, 8